welcome to this video about the driving experience of the Citroen C5 X7. Now, this was meant to be just 3 videos on the car, but I think I can squeeze a 4th one out as well. Let's see. Now, I'm not really good at this sort of like driving dynamic thing, because every YouTuber I see who does that driving dynamic thing is always stamping on the throttle and going around corners and going, ooh, ha, hee, hee, ooh, ha, ha, ooh, and that rubbish. And I'm not really good at that. I've already mentioned this in another video I did about a Saab. If you want to watch that, feel free. The link will appear up in one of the corners. And the reason is because I just don't drive very fast anymore. And this is why it's called the comfortable car club and not the go very fast around corners car club. In both previous videos, one was about the history, the other one was about the appreciation of the exterior and the interior, I touched upon how this car was marketed as German when it was first launched. And in terms of its driving experience, I wouldn't call it German, but I would say it's a lot less French than you'd expect. And why is that? We'll start with the steering. Modern Citroens seem to have their steering connected to the wheels by telepathy or telemetry or something. It just doesn't feel like it's connected to anything. It's so light that it feels you could just blow on the steering wheel and it will change direction. This is a completely different beast. This steering wheel actually has some nice weight to it. Now, let me make this clear. It's not sports car sharp, and it doesn't have the weight of what usually is a driver-oriented car. No, this has just the right balance. It's light enough to be comfortable to drive around town, but it's weighted enough so it doesn't feel like a horrible experience of basically twirling around the wheel in thin air. I have to add though, it is very direct. Every movement of the steering wheel is translated into motion in the tyres, and you can feel the car move. You can feel the wheels heaving around beneath the car. You know what they're doing. You know more or less which direction they're pointing in. I like that. The gearbox, and again, something that doesn't feel very French at all. Nearly all French cars that I've driven, especially Renaults, they don't feel like they've got gearboxes. They feel like they've got these vats of mud, and they're filled with bearings and bolts, and you just stick a rod in it and swirl it around until you get it click, and that's a gear. This doesn't feel like that at all. This feels much more direct and positive. That being said, not sports car sharp, not by any stretch of the imagination. It is a bit notchy, I will admit, but let me make this very clear, it's still nice to use. Maybe not the nicest in the world, but at least you don't have to struggle to get it in gear. You don't have to keep fighting it every time you shift up or down. And we get to the suspension. Now, big Citroens have always been famous for that magic carpet ride that's made possible thanks to Citroen's trademark hydro-pneumatic suspension. And this one doesn't have it, because this is, as near as makes no difference, a poverty spec Citroen. And it's got a conventional coil spring suspension setup. Doesn't really make much of a difference because this car is still very comfortable indeed. It's got a very supple, compliant setup that just glides over potholes and that sort of thing. Well, you do feel them a bit, I'll be honest with you. It's not like they don't exist. You can still hear them, but you don't feel them that much. It doesn't send a jolt up your backside. So it's not like you really need the hydro-pneumatic setup. It still is excellent, but this still wafts very well indeed. This makes this car perfect for long distance cruising, and you'll get to the end of a very long journey without feeling like you've been smacked with cricket bats for a few hours. And it's not just good for long journeys. In town, people forget this. In town, having a nice supple ride means you can glide over speed bumps at actually higher speeds that other cars with a lot stiffer suspension have to slow down for. If you've got a very stiff setup, every time you've got a speed bump or a pothole, that's your skeleton being punished for no particular reason. And if you've got kids, they'll be throwing up all over the place. So this car is set up for comfort rather than handling. If you're a boy racer, then obviously you should look somewhere else. This is not made for going around corners quickly. The car will flop about in the corners like a drunk skateboarder. You know, this suspension is not going to egg you on to go any faster, but then if it weren't the suspension not egging you on, it would be the engine. this is a very lowly spec car. This has the base engine, a 1.6 litre HDI diesel. This engine, it's a good engine. Is it right for this car? This is a very big, heavy car. 110 horsepower, which is what this engine produces, was great in the mid-90s. You know, that was a good amount of power. But in the 2000s, not so much. Cars are much heavier nowadays. These 110 horsepowers begin to feel a bit insufficient. Now, I did buy this car with that in mind. I knew what I was getting into. I was looking for economy, mostly. It's a car that's cheap to tax and also more frugal on fuel. But the thing is, you do have to work the gearbox more uphill if you've got some weight in the back, etc. I probably should very quickly mention that this car, in terms of speed, I mean, yes, it's not really about handling, but also top speed. There were versions of this car that had 240 horsepower, but even they weren't that fast. And this one, the 1.6 litre HDI, well, 0 to 60, a 2-digit number. Let's leave it at that. And yeah, look, it will shift. I'll be honest with you, it's still got shove because it's a diesel, so it's got that low end torque. That's good for what it's made for, which is transporting people around, you know, more than just a driver, usually a family and cargo. It's enough. I think maybe the 1.6 HDI is erring on the side of insufficient for that, but I'll be honest, it still does do the job. It's just not as punchy and responsive as I think most drivers would desire. I will say one thing though, it's very rough. It's a lot harsher than other engines. This car is very refined and well insulated. This car has laminated side glass, and you really need it because of all the harshness that comes from up front in terms of noise and everything. This engine doesn't feel like it runs on diesel. It feels more like it's chomping gravel. Not smooth at all. The 5-speed gearbox, I would like a 6th gear without a shadow of a doubt. I would like to go above 100 kilometers an hour or 60 miles an hour without going too far over 2000 revs. But in its defense, this engine might not be the most refined thing in the world or powerful, but it is a very economical engine and it's very reliable. This engine was first developed in the late 90s by Ford and Peugeot Citroen as a joint venture, and it's been honed ever since. It's gone out of production now because it doesn't comply with Euro 6 emission standards. It's equipped Fords, Mazdas, Volvos, Peugeots and Citroens obviously, but also like BMWs and Minis. And it's an absolute peach of an engine in terms of its reliability. My car has, as near as makes no difference, 180,000 miles. That's 295,000 kilometers, more or less, give or take. Maybe 183,000 miles would be more accurate. But I digress. And it's still going very strong. It still gets me amazing consumption figures. And you can actually see for yourselves. I've done some economy runs in some previous videos. The last one I did, I actually travelled to the highest point in the district where I live. So that meant a lot of uphill driving. And this car not only did it well, but it did it with some rather, I believe, desirable consumption figures. 5 litres per 100 kilometres, which is 56.4 mpg, and for such a big heavy car, I think that's excellent. So I consistently get great consumption figures in this car. If I'm driving in town, obviously that's very different. I get figures more in like 6.7, 6.8 litres per 100 kilometres, which is as near as makes no difference, 40 odd mpg. But it's not bad, I suppose, for a big fat diesel car like this one. One thing I should say though, the trip computer is actually really good because it's not too far off from reality. At most, it's usually about 0.2 litres per 100 kilometres off, which I think is a completely acceptable margin. That's good. So in conclusion, the Citroen C5 X7 is all about the comfort, as most Citroens are and should be. Even the top spec models, the 3 litre V6 HDIs with 240 brake horsepower, they were all about the waftiness, not about outright performance. It was about effortlessness. And as for this lowly spec 1.6 litre HDI, this brought that comfort, that both long range and short range comfort and mile munching to a much larger audience, especially here in Southern Europe where we're all more or less paupers. It was an affordable car. It's both cheap to acquire and cheap to run, and all of that is reflected in the driving experience. And this car is an absolute pleasure to drive. I think the best proof of how this car is so good to drive is when you own a car and you like driving it so much, you make up excuses to go drive it. That means that car is pretty excellent to drive. And that's this car. It's just like that. The previous car I had was sort of like a driver's car. It was a Mazda 6. And I would not look forward to getting into it and doing a long trip at all. This, however, it's marvellous. So I didn't hoon the car around corners. Apologies to those who are expecting that. That's not what this channel's about at all. It can be fun, I will admit, but no, the fun in this car is just relaxing in here, putting on some music and enjoying it. So anyway, I hope you didn't find that video to be completely awful. I thank you very much for watching if you've made it this far. Like, subscribe, share, all that rubbish. If you made it this far, thank you very much. And I hope to see you in a future video. There will be another installment. I bid you farewell.